Great. So I'm Roddy Theobald. I'm the youngish scholar that Dan introduced at the outset of the conference. I'm not sure how to feel about that. I'm we have. So this is work on the special education teacher pipeline in Washington. It's joint with Dan and Natsumi Nato and Marcy Stein. And in addition to Calder funding, I'd like to acknowledge funding from the National Center for Special Education Research at IES. So I've chosen a provocative subtitle to this presentation, which is the following. Do we have a special education teacher shortage, or do we have a shortage of special education teachers teaching special education? And, when we talk about teacher shortages, I know a lot of people in the room have made the point that talking about generic teacher shortages probably isn't the right way to talk about this. We're really talking about difficulties of staffing specific classrooms in specific school settings, but certainly in Washington, every way we've measured it, there's difficulty in staffing special education classrooms. But I think part of the point of this paper is that talking about that as a special education teacher shortage may be the wrong way to think about it. So to frame this, I'm just going to present some facts about the special education public teacher workforce in Washington. So the x-axis represents the years of data we're looking at, 2010 through 2017. In those years, there's roughly 10,000 teachers in the public workforce in each year who have the right endorsement to teach in a special education classroom. Now, the nice thing about our data is in these years, we can see what classrooms they're actually teaching. And in these years, about 60% to 2/3 of them are actually teaching in special education classrooms. This is identified by position codes in the teacher data, just to make sure we don't miss anybody, teachers who are teaching at least 50% students with disabilities. So I'm going to return to this figure a couple times throughout this talk, but the first takeaway here is that there are thousands of teachers in the public workforce right now who have the right endorsement to teach special education, but are not. Okay. Second fact about the teacher workforce is about teacher attrition. Lots of teacher shortage issues are pinned on teacher attrition, particularly shortages in special education classrooms. Same years of data. Here is the attrition rate from the public teaching workforce of teachers in special education classrooms. This is somewhere between 7 and 10% per year. Point one is that this is higher than for teachers in other types of classrooms. Just for comparison, these are the comparable attrition rates for teachers in elementary classrooms. It's not actually as much higher than you might expect given the rhetoric around special education teacher attrition. And just to relate this to the previous figure, if you look at this figure and just account for the teachers who are leaving at the end of each school year, this is the part of those bars that's being made transparent. There are definitely a large number of teachers leaving the workforce every year, but roughly speaking, theoretically, you could cover those classes with teachers already in the workforce many times over who have the right endorsement to teach those classes. Now, that's not happening for a variety of reasons that I think we can discuss at the end, but the point of this project is to try to explore different predictors of which teachers with endorsements in special education are in the workforce, are teaching in special education classrooms, and are staying in those positions over time. And we're doing that using data that we've collected as part of the Teacher Education Learning Collaborative. This is a partnership that Dan and I have been working on for about a decade now, which is why I think he thinks of me as youngish. The way TELC works is that we partner with 15 teacher education programs in Washington. They give us data on all of their teacher candidates going back some number of years. We link it with data from our partners at the State Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction in Washington to create a data set that tracks candidates from where they went to school, where they do their student teaching, and then into the workforce. So Dan's presented work using the TELC data at prior Calder conferences. For the purposes of this talk, I'm focusing on the roughly 1,300 candidates who are graduating with a special education endorsement from their program. And because of the TELC data, we know a lot about these folks. We know where they did their student teaching, the specific teacher who supervised them. We know what credentials and endorsements they had when they entered the workforce, and we've also surveyed faculty members from their programs about curricula. We can follow them into the workforce, see whether they're hired as a teacher, hired into a special education classroom, and we've also surveyed special education directors in the state about curricula in districts. And ultimately, outcomes we're looking at longer term are retention in the workforce, retention in special education classrooms, and then student achievement. I'm not going to talk about student achievement today. We're not there yet. Stay tuned. And you can scan through all our regression tables. This was posted yesterday as a working paper. The short story is that practically none of this is predictive of the outcomes we're considering in this paper. Really, what it boils down to is a story about credentials and endorsements. So that's what I'll be focusing on with the remainder of my time here. So, first result from the paper, a nice thing about the TELC data is we have data on teacher candidates, not teachers. So we can look at rates at which candidates who graduate from programs actually enter the teaching workforce. So the x-axis now is not years, school years, it's graduation years. For each of these cohorts of graduates, we track them for up to 3 years and see whether they actually become a public school teacher in Washington. That's right, we don't observe out of state, we don't observe private school. So this is rates of hiring, in-state hiring into public schools. Here are those rates for graduates who have only a special education credential. It's somewhere between 80 and 90% are getting jobs in public schools every year. Something we've shown before is quite a bit higher than for other endorsement areas. If you compare this to graduates who are graduating with only an elementary education endorsement, for example, particularly coming out of the Great Recession, those hiring rates were a disaster. The job options for elementary ed candidates were quite poor for a while there. They've caught up as the labor market has tightened over time. But another point I want to make with this slide is that these aren't the only categories we have to consider, because dual endorsement is extremely common in Washington. So there's a category of candidates who are graduating with both a special education and an elementary ed endorsement. Here are those hiring rates for those candidates, and it's very akin to the hiring rates for graduates from just special education programs. And one of my co-authors, Marcy, was a faculty member at a dual endorsement program for 30 years, and they make a very explicit pitch to candidates who may initially be interested in just elementary ed that this special education endorsement is a ticket to a job. So this is often part of the selling point for getting folks into these programs. So I'm now going to focus on just those first two categories. This is graduates with only a special endorsement and graduates who have both a dual endorsement in special education and something else. And we're going to track them over time as they enter the workforce. So in this figure, 100% is going to represent all the graduates of these programs for the years of data we have. Everything I've shown you so far is just raw numbers. These are now regression adjusted estimates from hazard models, but it's similar to the raw data. I'm first going to show you rates of entry and retention in the overall public teacher workforce for these two categories of teachers. Blue is dual endorsed, yellow is teachers who only have a special education endorsement. None of these differences are statistically significant. Basically, overall, the rates of workforce entry and retention are quite similar between these two groups of teachers. What's quite different is when we look at entry rates into special education classrooms and retention rates in special education classrooms. This is the dashed line. Yellow is for teachers with just a special education endorsement. Blue is for dual endorsed teachers. Basic message here, not surprising. Dual endorsed candidates are much less likely to enter a special education classroom. And it's a little hard to eyeball from this, but they're significantly less likely to stay in special education classrooms conditional on entering. That last figure there means that about less than half of graduates with a dual endorsement enter the workforce, stay in the workforce, and are still teaching in a special education classroom by their 4th year. Okay, so these are quite big differences between the two groups. That said, they're descriptive. There could be many reasons why candidates do and don't pursue a dual endorsement, and the distinction between descriptive evidence and causal evidence is really important in this case because the state just passed a law requiring, well, changes a lot of things about the credential process, but it makes special education a secondary endorsement. One implication of that is that every graduate of special education program is going to be dual endorsed, and the extent to which this is going to affect staffing of special education classrooms really depends on whether this is a causal effect. So we do our best with this. We try to leverage the fact that to get a second endorsement, you have to pass a credential test. So everyone in this figure is someone who passed the special education endorsement test in the state. I've centered it so the passing score is 0. This is only people who are at least interested enough in a dual endorsement to take the test in another subject. And x-axis is their score the first time they take the test. Y-axis is the proportion of folks at each of these scores who ultimately pass the test. Obviously, everyone who passes the first time ultimately passes. To left, you see lots of people eventually pass the test. You can take it as many times as you want, subject to cost restraints is something we think about with Massachusetts sometimes. But there is this nice sharp cutoff at the passing score that actually results in a pretty sharp cutoff in your probability of getting a dual endorsement at this cutoff. So we're using this as an instrument to look at least for these marginal candidates, whether getting a dual endorsement actually reduces your likelihood of teaching in special education. And it does. This reduced form estimate doesn't look very big, but the IV estimate in percentage terms is actually quite large. So there's a little bit of causal evidence suggesting that getting a dual endorsement actually reduces your probability of ultimately teaching in a special education classroom once you enter the workforce. Okay? Thank you. So I'm going to return to this figure to conclude because, as I mentioned at the outset, we have a lot of evidence that the staffing of special education classrooms is a challenge in Washington. And I just want to make sure I mention something that Ijun mentioned and that a lot of folks in the audience are probably thinking. Some of the country's leading advocates of differential pay are in the room. This seems to be a particularly ripe opportunity for that, to pay teachers in special education classrooms more to teach in those settings. We can't speak to that because there's no policy to study. To my knowledge, with a very small handful of cases, special education teachers are paid the same as other teachers in basically every district in the state for the years of data we're considering. So really this ends up being a story about the hidden role that states play in what subjects teachers are allowed to teach, and a story about potential unintended consequences of dual endorsement. Now that comes with a couple caveats. Certainly the motivation behind this dual endorsement policy is, some from, Tim's prior work in Florida and elsewhere showing that students with disabilities in general education classrooms may benefit from a teacher who has a special education endorsement. The flip side of that is that students with disabilities in a special education classroom may benefit from having a teacher with a content area endorsement. So that's the student achievement paper that's going to be coming up next. We also don't know how these policies are going to influence the number of teachers who actually get a special education endorsement. We could be increasing the pool of everyone who could teach special education and thus mitigate any unintended consequences that come from everyone having the opportunity to leave these classrooms. But I do think that it provides some concerns about the potential unintended consequences of this policy. Thank you.